We live, it seems, in an increasingly polarised world. And a polarised world brings its own particular issues. Because the only arena in which a polarised world is accepted is in the world of sport. In sport, you have winners. And as an inevitable consequence of that, you also unavoidably have losers. Of course there are draws, but it's not designed to be that way. Sport is a way of finding out who the winners are, who's the strongest, who's the fastest, who's the most skillful, who has the most endurance. In sport this is accepted and expected, and no one steps onto the court or the field or into the ring without this being understood. And because this is understood, there are no further ramifications beyond the central question: who's the best? In life, in general, this is more problematic. And we have, in my own country, just witnessed, and continue to witness, the problems with bringing the winner-takes-all rationale of sport into that of the wider world. I am talking, of course, of the issue of Brexit. We had a referendum. It was a contest in which only one side could win. It was a binary choice. By its very design, there would be only those who won totally or those who lost totally. There was to be no points victory in this bout. Now, it's probably true that neither side really appreciated the uncompromising nature of this decision. The Remainers disdainfully discounted the possibility of losing, and so viewed the vote as no more than a confirmation of what they believed would happen. So probably considered it as a way of shutting up the Eurosceptics once and for all. Leavers, on the other hand, who probably never believed that it would go their way, but cast their vote just the same, and were just as astonished as I was that so many other people thought as they did. The result could be seen as a rebuke to the arrogance of what we might call progressives and to the enduring value of genuine democracy. But like I say, Remainers never thought they would lose, which is why they've been in such denial ever since. Although they won't admit it, they know that only one side can win, which is why the Remainers in chief, our honourable members of Parliament, are trying every trick in the book to be seen to be accepting losing without actually losing. Unsurprisingly, this is proving impossible to achieve. Away from Brexit, and more generally speaking in the political realm, we remain in this polarised world. Right-wingers versus left-wingers is the traditional and obvious divide. But the dividing point is not where it should be, in the centre, and has now moved by dint of the clown world that we now inhabit to a point a fraction to the right of the extreme left. The left is now violent in word and deed, violent, uncompromising Marxist identity politics, which pretends to include all ethnic, religious and sexual minorities, along with the vanishingly small transgender community, which supposedly faces the right, which is everything else. And that includes not only extreme right-wing identity politics, along with the small number of genuine racists and fascists, but also mainstream conservatives, classical liberals, and even left-of-centre social democrats, and anyone else who doesn't subscribe to the extreme far left. Fortunately, many ethnic and religious minority individuals, along with free-thinking homosexuals and transgender activists, are not buying this quite literal groupthink. But the really important distinction between the two types of people is not, despite appearances to the contrary, between Leavers and Remainers, and neither is it between the left and the right. And despite continued attempts to draw the battle lines between black and white, between Islam and the West, or even between good people and bad people, and although there is much overlap between all these groups, none of these are the vital distinction. I believe that it's deeper than that, much deeper in fact. As I've mentioned before, I'm a plumber and I'm self-employed, and that makes for a pretty hard life in some ways. I'm not complaining, since there are billions of people worse off than me, but it's a hard life for me because I'm not particularly suited to it. I'm not much of a businessman, and I can't say that I'm especially motivated. So I'd be lying if I said that I've made a success of it. I haven't. I'm sure there are countless millions who would willingly trade their salaried job in an office with their sales targets and their key performance indicators and their line managers breathing down their neck for the life of, and the lie of, being your own boss. But you'd think that, as a self-employed tradesman, that I would naturally favour the political right wing of small government and low taxes. You'd think, wouldn't you, that I'd be a capitalist? Well, yes and no. Being a poor businessman and a bit of a pessimist to boot, I'm not really reaping the rewards that come with my position, but I nevertheless still feel the downsides acutely. When I make a mistake, I am punished immediately, in the pocket. I remember once I was up on a roof fitting a boiler flue. It was only a bungalow, but there was no scaffolding, and the drop fell away from the house quite dangerously. As I was doing this, I was conscious that I was beginning to lose my footing, and was thinking that it was quite possible that I could die, or worse, be crippled if I did in fact fall off this roof. Later that evening, since I didn't fall, I was watching Question Time on the telly, and there was this Tory businessman type who was talking about how he, as an entrepreneur, a word I despise, was one of society's risk takers. And I remember thinking of the kind of risk he was probably talking about. A financial one probably, and perhaps not even with his own money. He might even be risking his reputation and his standing. Big deal, I thought. I was quite literally risking life and limb. Well, why was I? And why didn't I take precautions? Why was there no scaffolding? Well, there was no scaffolding because it was an elderly lady who needed a new boiler, and scaffolding wasn't in the budget. If scaffolding had been in the budget, she wouldn't have got her boiler, and I wouldn't have got the job. So it's at times like that that I can be attracted to something softer than capitalism, something a bit more gentle than red in tooth and claw. At times like that, I can be attracted to some kind of a safety net, a social rather than a literal one. At times like that, I can be attracted by a welfare system. Yes, there are times when I can be attracted to socialism. For a relatively new philosophy, socialism, along with its harder-edged cousin, communism, had half the world on its side a century after Das Kapital, so I would hardly have been in a tiny minority, and socialism has had many benefits. When my father had his first heart attack, the supposedly ramshackle and crisis-ridden National Health Service scooped him up, helicoptered him to King's College Hospital in South London, and saved his life. During the few weeks he was in the intensive care unit, I noticed that the private wing was right next door. I got talking to several of the nurses there and wondered how much better it would be in the private wing, since it was pretty impressive anyway. They told me when the private patients got bad enough, they just wheeled them in with the NHS patients, since the private wing couldn't compete. We are endlessly told about how our NHS is cash-strapped and in crisis. But I think that's its natural state. In crisis or not, it was magnificent. And what did it cost me? Did I have to take out loans? Did I have to sell my parents' home or remortgage mine? No. The cost for saving my dad's life was precisely £0 and 0 pence. Without that kind of big government socialism, he would have died that day. In the event, he got another decade of life. And in my weaker moments, I can also be attracted to the idea of a salaried job, with all the benefits that come with that. A regular monthly salary to make it easier to budget, sick pay, holiday pay, paid national holidays, a pension, and maybe even a company car. Sometimes I'm also attracted by the thought of going to work in clean clothes and then coming home in very nearly clean clothes. So unlike some others, and particularly unlike many Americans who have never experienced any kind of socialism, I can definitely see the attraction of a cushy job and or a social welfare safety net from the cradle to the grave, as the Labour government successfully sold it to the British electorate in 1945. But although I can see its attractions, I also know, since the devil is in the detail, that there is a deal to be had, a bargain to be struck, a compromise that might be a compromise too far. Because although my father's excellent medical treatment didn't cost me anything at the time, it wasn't really free. Like everything in life, you pay for it somehow. For the NHS, he, along with me and everyone else, paid for it through our taxes. That's the deal. That's a bargain that we in the UK have collectively entered into, willingly, and it's a bargain that we are overwhelmingly happy with. Some pay more than others, and some collect more than others, but we rationalise that as just the luck of the draw. Sure, some people abuse their health and are a drain on the rest of us, but we accept that as the cost. The benefit is that should the worst happen, we will be taken care of. But healthcare is one thing. In healthcare, the deal is a fairly straightforward one. It's a deal that we can make sense of. It's a deal that I, for one, am prepared to enter into when it is just about health. But in a wider sense, I'm not so sure. In China, they have just commemorated the 30th anniversary of the massacre of the protesters in Tiananmen Square. Or rather, they haven't, since the ruling Chinese Communist Party, in a textbook example of Orwellian doublethink, refused to acknowledge the significance of the date at all. The fantastically courageous and humane, but sadly anonymous, Tank Man may still be iconic worldwide, but it's a fair bet that anyone in China under the age of 35 will never have seen that startling image of a lone man in shirt sleeves facing down a column of Chinese main battle tanks armed with nothing but a couple of shopping bags. I was 21 at the time, and I remember the protests, but from the luxury of a truly free society, as we once had, gave the desire for freedom of the world's most populous nation only passing attention. But I do remember thinking at the time that the many English-speaking young Chinese who were talking to the Western press were demystifying the Chinese as a whole. These earnest, brave and optimistic young souls really believed that they could shame the Chinese government into becoming democrats. These Chinese, at least, were full of passion and righteous indignation, and as far from the casually racist stereotype of inscrutable as it was possible to get. I was also, at least as far as my own selfish worldview allowed, optimistic for them. But as we know, the protest led to nothing except the consolidation of the already dominant one-party state. The Chinese People's Army's tanks crushed not only the bodies of the people, but the very idea of a free society once and for all, as was its intention. I, along with many of my contemporaries in the West, often wonder what happened to those genuine and bright-eyed freedom fighters after the massacre, and particularly to Tank Man. Was he killed that day? Was he machine gunned once he was out of the range of the cameras? Was he arrested? Was he tortured and spat out again by the communist state like a Chinese Winston Smith, broken and shell-shocked and too terrified to do anything but condemn his past behaviour and profess his love for the party. Maybe he just melted back into the crowd and was never identified, either by the Chinese state or by the Western media. Did he perhaps manage to get out and emigrate incognito to one of the democracies that he wanted China to emulate? Sadly, we'll never know. But the West quickly forgot about what might have been in China, since we have much more interesting fish to fry closer to home, as the Berlin Wall was breached without a shot being fired, as that other, more menacing, but as it turned out, ultimately less dangerous, communist leviathan of the Soviet Empire collapsed 5 months later. It took 10 years for Poland to break free of communism, 10 months for East Germany, 10 weeks for Czechoslovakia, 10 days for Hungary, and only 10 days for the Romanians to summarily execute the hated Nicolae Ceausescu and his revolting wife and banish totalitarianism from Europe. In China, it stayed put, enriched by the West seeking Chinese low-wage coolies to make our stuff, emboldened by the West's turning a blind eye to their authoritarian methods, and enabled by the surveillance technology that they have been able to buy and develop with that wealth to build a terrifyingly efficient and invasive security apparatus. The totalitarian Chinese police state doesn't look like it's going anywhere anytime soon. Because the Chinese population have been offered a different deal, although the word offer is a bit of a misnomer here, since no other offer is actually on the table, unless one counts persecution by the state as the alternative. No, because although the Chinese government did use the army to ruthlessly suppress the burgeoning democracy movement, the scale of the protests did rattle them. The members of the ruling Politburo must have thought long and hard before sending in the tanks, and when they did so, they must have given a fair amount of thought to not having to do it again, and again, and again. So rather than continuing to take their inspiration from Orwell's brutal 1984, they instead picked up their other handbook to a softer, but no less dystopian future, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. And it seemed that they liked Huxley's vision of the future as much as Orwell's. Now, to anyone who has been following the direction of the modern Chinese state, can't have failed to notice that they are ramping up the surveillance infrastructure to the nth degree, with facial recognition software being only the latest trinket in the Communist Party's invasive toolkit. But whilst constant and unblinking surveillance of the entire population is all very well in spotting rebellion as it happens, what might be a better idea, they reasoned, was to make it so that the population wasn't inclined to rebel. And what better way to do that than to give them something to lose? And so the Chinese Communist Party, in defiance of and in contradiction to all its core principles and its very raison d'etre, its stated raison d'etre anyhow, began to embrace capitalism and even went into business with the capitalist running dogs of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia, Canada, and the big daddy of them all, the United States of America. In the last 30 years, China has come from nowhere to become the second biggest economy in the world. It has made enormous progress in lifting the great majority of its citizens out of their previous poverty, and now strides the globe like a colossus and has become a serious contender to the US as top dog. It has often been said in the past that freedom and democracy were prerequisites to prosperity. After all of the most prosperous countries were liberal social democracies. But the Chinese Communist Party could see no reason why they should grant freedom to their people. As they saw it, the people wanted food, not freedom. Of course, in an ideal world, we should all have both. But if we can make them rich, so the thinking goes, they won't want to be free. If we let them have iPhones, they'll be so distracted that the idea of freedom won't even occur to them. So that's their deal. That's the deal being offered, or rather given to them. Surrender all your freedoms to us, and in return we'll make you rich, comfortable, and we'll look after you. So would I take the deal? Would you? I don't reckon Tankman would have. But the Chinese government are being, if not exactly honest about it, they are at least being upfront. And judging from reports that I've heard, it seems as if the Chinese public have swallowed that rationale whole. Although it could conceivably be that the average Chinese Joe just doesn't want to get on the wrong side of Big Brother. And who could blame him? Either way, it's a win-win for President Xi and the rest of his Get Fresh crew. Happy compliance or fearful compliance. It's still compliance. Our glorious British authorities, on the other hand, are being understandably cagey about their motives. Being the inheritors of at least a culture of freedom and rights of the individual, if not a reality, the British versions are secret totalitarians and have to hide their true intentions in a fog of euphemisms. They daren't say such a thing as, give us your freedom in exchange for security. They daren't say that. They pretend that we can have both. What they talk about is a balance between liberty and security. The very mention of the word balance in a discussion about liberty and individual civil rights should set off every freedom-loving alarm bell in your head. Balance being uttered in this context by some politician with the connivance of some freedom-hating copper somewhere in the background means that another slice of your freedom is being sacrificed on the altar of security. But they nevertheless think they're pushing at an open door. They think that so long as it is presented in the right way and with the right language, they can get us to give up anything. Pitched right, they're betting they can get us to lock ourselves up and throw away the key. And on current evidence, they could be right. The Chinese population has, by the looks of it, been pacified and neutered. But it took the Chinese army to turn on their own to do it. What excuse have we got? We've sat and done nothing while they put up 4.5 million CCTV cameras so they can keep us under permanent surveillance. Donald Trump said he was going to build a wall along the Mexican border, and he was ridiculed for suggesting that he was going to get Mexico to pay for it. The British government has us all under 24-hour surveillance, and we have paid for it, and willingly, it seems. And rather than being out on the streets and tearing these damn things down, the British population are all sitting on their arses watching sodding Love Island, or whatever that vacuous shite is called. Rather than facing down a column of tanks, we're all gorging ourselves on bake-offs, celebrity twats come dancing, and internet pornography, whilst we surrender our freedom of speech, along with much, much else, in favour of a pathetic longing for security. Tankman? Wankman more like. The Chinese People's Army turned on their people. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine the British Army doing such a thing. I know, there was Northern Ireland, but it's not the same. In one incident, the British Army killed 14 people, but it's never been forgotten, and it never will be. And nor should it be. But how many were killed in China in 1989? Hundreds? Thousands? Tens of thousands? Those protesters now know the viciousness of their government, and they were brought in line. And as far as I'm aware, the protests in autonomous Hong Kong accepted, they haven't stepped out of line since. Do we face that? Will the British Army turn on us? despite the recent ludicrous attempts to politicise the army to be on the lookout for patriots as potential far-right extremists. I don't think I'm being naive in believing that the soldiers are not yet ready to turn their guns on their compatriots. So we don't face what those protesters faced 30 years ago. We do, however, face a government that is just as corrupt, just as venal and just as capable of selling us down the river to ensure that they stay where they are, at the top, but is not quite as willing to send in the tanks. Yet. But they will, when they have sufficiently infiltrated and contaminated the army with their warped illiberal philosophies. They will. They're just waiting for the right time. So we can't wait for that right time. Now is the time to make our presence felt. Actually, yesterday was the time. But we didn't do it yesterday, and we didn't do it last month, or last year, or last decade. That would have been the best time to do it. The second best time is now. And because we have waited until the second best time, we now only have a second best society to defend. We have to make a stand. We have to stand for freedom of speech, for freedom of movement, freedom of association, freedom from invasive government scrutiny. We have to stand for the freedom to be who we are. Because who are we? Are we left-wingers or right-wingers? Are we capitalists or socialists? Are we white or are we black, gay or straight, rich or poor? Are we this or are we that? Like I say, these are not the abiding differences. These are not crucial. The crucial difference between the two types of people is this. Those that are willing to sell their freedom along with the freedom of others for the safety of the padded cell, and those who are not. So we're to you.